Hi folks, and welcome to this presentation on calculating diluted EPS. This question is based on what you did for your final test review, so it would be helpful if you had that problem in front of you so that you could see the data and you'd be able to walk through the solution with the video. So let's begin. And as you know, when calculating diluted EPS, we always have to start off with our basic EPS. In this particular question, they don't give you that amount, so you're going to have to calculate it. So you're going to do it the same way you did in your previous second semester course, is you're going to look at your earnings available to common shareholders, divide it by your weighted average number of shares in order to calculate your earnings per share. So now, in our question, in Part B of the other information, they give us the net earnings. Now, what we have to determine is if we want to know what net earnings are available to common shareholders, we're going to have to deduct any preferred share dividend. In this case, if you look at the information that you were given, you can see that the preferred shares are cumulative, meaning whether or not a dividend is declared, you still have to deduct it from the numerator. So in our particular question, we see that these these preferred shares that are outstanding weren't issued until October the 1st of the current year. So therefore, if you're looking at trying to determine how much of a preferred share dividend would have gone to, or at least be owing to, the preferred shareholders, you'd have to look at Part E, because it tells you there that they were issued on October the 1st of the current year, and in the actual data of the question, they tell you that the preferred share dividend is $5, which translates to $1.25 per quarter. So therefore, the dividend that we would have paid out to our preferred shareholders, given that the shares were cumulative, would have been $30,000 only times $1.25, or 1 quarter. And the reason for that is that those dividends weren't actually, or the shares weren't actually outstanding any more than 1 quarter. So the actual amount of dividends that would have been paid, or at least owing to preferred shareholders because they were cumulative, would have only at most been 1 quarter, or $1.25's worth per preferred share. So we're only going to deduct $37,500 to come up with earnings available to common of $752,500. Now, our shares outstanding, which we're going to divide that earnings available to common by, we know two things. In the question, it says that 600,000 shares are outstanding at the end of the current year, for which we're calculating our basic EPS. And we also know that in additional information H, it says no other shares were issued or retired during the year. So because of that, we know that we had 600,000 common shares outstanding from the beginning right to the end of the year. So there was no change, so we're going to keep that 600,000 shares as it was throughout the year. So therefore, your basic EPS is $1.25. So we've calculated that. The next step is going to be to look at each of the securities that we have that are convertible, and we have 5 different securities here. We have the 8% debentures. We have 9.5% debentures, and again, don't forget, debentures are just bonds. We have $11 options, $20 options, and we'll talk a little bit about the options a bit, the $20 options in particular, a bit later, as well as preferred shares that are convertible to common. So what we need to do in step 2 is we need to determine which, if any of these securities, is dilutive, meaning that the EPS impact, the individual effect or individual EPS impact of each of these securities, if they were converted, and in fact some of them were converted, is going to be less than our basic EPS, because any EPS impacts on securities that are not converted or are actually either in whole or in part converted, if their individual EPS is less than the basic, then it's dilutive and included in the Cascade worksheet, whereby we calculate diluted EPS. So let's begin with the debentures. And we can see that in item B of the other information, it gives us some information on the debentures. It tells us that the amount of interest on the 8% debentures throughout the period was $216,000. They also tell us that on the 9.5% debentures, there was $250,000 in interest expense all throughout the period that those debentures were outstanding. Well, here's the deal. The fact of the matter is that when we're calculating the EPS impact of each of these bonds, we have to remember how we calculated or what the formula is. We're looking to find out if we had converted these debentures earlier, how much interest expense in the numerator of the EPS calculation would have been avoided. And again, if you think back to your basic EPS calculation, if we're trying to determine the EPS impact of these particular debentures, the 8% ones, we want to know how much would our net earnings available to common shareholders have been affected in the numerator. Well, the first thing is, if you had converted those debentures into shares, your effect would have been on your earnings because your net income would not have included interest expense on those bonds. Why? Because if you had converted them, they would have been common shares and they wouldn't have existed as bonds. So we look to calculate the EPS impact if those shares were converted. And in fact, we would have avoided expensing $216,000 in interest on those debentures. And again, because earnings is an after-tax amount, we want to calculate that impact on an after-tax basis. So if we multiply it by 1 less 0.4 or 40% being the tax rate, we're going to get in our numerator, our earnings available to common shareholders would have actually increased because we wouldn't have had that interest expense after tax of $129,600. Similarly, how much would our weighted average number of common shares outstanding have changed? Well, again, the question tells us that each of these each $100 of the convertible debentures was convertible into 7 common shares. In fact, in our question, the face value of the 8% debentures was $2.5 million. Therefore, every $100 bond of these $2.5 million in bonds, each $100 bond was convertible into 7 shares. So in this case, we're going to have 25,000 bonds, each bond convertible into 7 shares. And I got 25,000 bonds by doing what's in the bracket. 2.5 million divided by $100, because we're trying to calculate how many bonds we have. That would give us 25,000 bonds, each of which is convertible into 7 common shares. So we know that if we had converted those bonds to common, we would have had 175,000 weighted average common shares in addition. Okay, so therefore, the EPS impact would have been 74 cents per common share. That's less than our basic EPS, so it's dilutive. Similarly, we're going to look at the 9.5% debentures, and we have a similar situation here. In this particular case, they tell us that the 9.5% debentures had carried $250,000 in interest expense. So again, if those 9.5% debentures had been converted at the earliest available point in time during the year, that means that we would have avoided booking interest expense of this much. And on an after-tax basis, that would have given us an extra $150,000 in income that would have been available to the common shareholders. Now, the denominator, again, we want to know how much would our WACs have increased by had we converted those convertible bonds into shares earlier in the year. So therefore, again, you'll notice that the face value for these bonds is identical to the 8% bonds, but that's just coincidental. But the concept is the same. We want to look at how many bonds we had that are convertible, in this case, into 6 common shares. Well, every $100 bond is convertible into 6 shares, but we have 2.5 million face value for the bonds. So therefore, if we solve this bracket, we, again, as we did in this case, coincidentally enough, have 25,000 bonds. Each of those 25,000 bonds is convertible into 6 shares, so therefore we're going to have 150,000 extra shares. So therefore, 150,000 in the numerator, which would increase the numerator by 150,000. The denominator would be increased by 150,000. That gives us an EPS impact on the 9.5% debentures of $1, which again is less than your basic EPS, so these two are dilutive. So that concludes our analysis of the 8% debentures and 9.5% debentures. So you might want to take a little break, perhaps replay the video, and then we're going to start working on the options. Okay, folks, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the two options here. We have $11 options and $20 options. Now, we know in our question that from the data that we're given, if you guys have a look at item G, you can see there that the shares on average during the year traded for $40. The exercise price on the $11 options, okay, is less than the market price. So we know that these options are in the money and could have been converted during the year. The fact of the matter was they weren't converted, but we still have to figure out, in order to calculate our diluted EPS, we know that these are going to be in the calculation of diluted EPS. Why? Well, first of all, we know that when we look at the EPS impact of options, we know that in the numerator, all right, it doesn't affect your earnings available to common shareholders, right? So there's not going to be any income impact on that, as well as no preferred share dividend impact on that. So if we're looking to calculate the impact on the $11 options, because we know they're dilutive, we know their EPS impact is going to be 0. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to figure out, or we do know, that we're going to actually issue, or if the options had been converted into shares or had been exercised, we know that we would have had more common shares out there. So what we need to do is we need to use the Treasury stock method, which really looks more at calculating the number of shares we would have issued, which we know from our question was 200,000 shares. But what we need to do is we need to figure out if these guys had converted their options into shares, they would have paid us $11 for each of those 200,000 shares. We would have taken the proceeds, which would have been $2.2 million, divide that by $40, $40 being the market price, because here when we're trying to calculate the shares retired, we make the assumption under the Treasury stock method that with the money that we get from the investors, we go into the marketplace and buy back the shares at $40 a share. So we would have only been able to buy back 55,000 of the 200,000 shares that we would have had to issue them. So at net, if you compare the 200,000 to the 55,000, we would have only issued new shares of 145,000. All right, so that's going to impact our WACC when we're calculating our diluted EPS. So we need to hold on to that figure of 145,000. Now, let's look at the other set of options. Again, I said that because the exercise price was less than $40 a share, which is the average market price throughout the period, these options are also dilutive because they would have been converted, or could have been converted. The investors decided not to. Maybe they wanted to wait to see if the market price got better in subsequent years. Whatever it was, we don't know, but we know they're dilutive. So now, what we're going to do with these options, they have something a little bit different than the $11 options did. If you have a look at item D, two things come to mind. It says that they weren't issued until May the 1st. Okay, so they were issued during the year, right? So we have to think about the impact of backdating. It also kind of ladders the exercise price because it says here that they could have exercised the options at an exercise price of $27 per share in X9, which is 2 years from now, or $25 in X10, or $20 in X11. So the question becomes, regardless, I suppose, of what the exercise price is that we're going to use, each of those exercise prices is less than $40. So the fact of the matter is the options are dilutive. But which number do I use? Which exercise price do I use? Well, we always use the lowest one. The reason being that we don't know if these investors would convert in X9 and X10 and X11, but we're sitting here today, so we're trying to figure out what's the worst case scenario that we could come up with. And don't forget, if we had exercised, or if the exercise price was the lowest price, which in this case would be $20, we would have less money to go back into the marketplace and buy the shares back at $40. So that means we would have been able to retire or repurchase fewer shares, right? So it will always give us the most dilutive scenario, or the most new shares issued, if we look at the lowest option price or lowest option exercise price. Because again, that's at the point at which we would get the least amount of money from our investors, given that we're going to have to go back into the marketplace, or would have gone back into the marketplace to buy the shares at $40 a share to buy them back. So we're going to use the $20 for that reason. And again, we know the options are in the money or they have intrinsic value. So therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the number of shares that we would issue. And again, we're trying to figure out what the impact on WACs is going to be. So what we're doing now under the Treasury stock method is looking at what's the number of new shares that we would have had to have issued if these options were exercised over the period that they're outstanding. So again, because the options weren't outstanding before May the 1st, we know that we could have, at December 31st, we could backdate them, or we would have, if they were exercised, they wouldn't have been exercised before May the 1st. So we're calculating the WACs impact by looking at 50,000 shares that would have been issued, but multiplying it by 8/12, because don't forget, it's 8 months from May the 1st to December 31st. And again, we're doing a weighted calculation because in our denominator, we're going to figure out what impact these diluted options are going to have on our WACs, right? So it's all weighted. That means, on average, we would have issued 33,333 shares. We would have retired using the proceeds that we would have got from investors, dividing it by 40, okay? We would have got 25,000 shares that we would have retired, but don't forget, we have to multiply this by 8/12 as well, because we're doing a weighted calculation. So that would mean that we would have had to have retired 16,667 shares. So on average, we would have been issuing in new shares 16,333 new shares. So therefore, that would be the number of new shares that we would issue for these options. And we're going to use that when we do our diluted EPS calculation. The final convertible security we have to look at now are the preferred shares. So now, if we look at these preferred shares, what do we know? Well, first of all, we know that the preferred shares were issued on October the 1st, as we mentioned before. So if we were looking at here at December 31st, we want to figure out what would the EPS impact have been on those preferred of those preferred shares if we had converted them earlier. Well, here we are sitting back at December 31st. We couldn't have converted them to common before October the 1st because they were just issued October the 1st. So what would the preferred share dividend be that we would have avoided? Well, we would have avoided paying $5 a share for the 30,000 shares that are outstanding, but we would have only backdated 3 months of 12, right? Because this is annual, right? But this is annual as well, right? So we take like with like. So all we're saying here is that we would have been able to backdate and avoid dividends of only 1 quarter. And that's going to give us $37,500. The other way we did this when we were doing our basic EPS, you could have just done this by saying, well, I would have avoided paying, or dividends avoided would have been $1.25 for the quarter. But $5 times 3 over 12, that is $1.25. So all I did here was do it annually, looking at it annually for 3 months of the 12 months for the year. But it doesn't matter. You can do it either way. If I'm looking at how many new shares I would have issued had I converted the preferred shares to common, again, I would have only, again, I'm doing a weighted calculation here. Each of those 30,000 shares, from the question, we know they're convertible into 9 common shares. That's in part E of your additional information. And again, the earliest opportunity I would have been able to convert is 3 months earlier than December 31st. of the entire 12 months of the year. So that's the October 1st, right? So that would mean that WACs would have increased by $67,500, leaving me with 56 cents a share, which would have been my EPS impact. And again, less than $1.25, so they're dilutive as well. So this concludes step 2 of our diluted EPS process in order to calculate our diluted EPS. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go into step 3, and we're going to figure out now how we're going to do the diluted EPS calculation. So if you want to take a break and go back through the options and make sure you understand it before we move on to calculating our final step, which is the diluted EPS. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at our diluted EPS cascade. Now, you know that the basic EPS numbers that we got from above, this is when we did this calculation up here in step 1. I'm just repeating it here. Now, the question is with the options, which options go first? All right, well, we always put the options that will create the greatest impact in the WACs, right? Because that's going to give you the most dilutive position. So, which means I'm going to be issuing more shares with the $11 options, right? And more new shares than I am with the $20 options. So these options would go first because they would lead to the most new shares being issued. So your most dilutive position would be coming up first. So therefore, I know from what we've learned before in options, it's not going to make any difference to earnings available to common, because even if I had converted those options to common shares, it doesn't impact the numerator. There's no effect on income and no effect on preferred share dividends. So now you'll notice that I have nothing here, nothing for the $20 options. I have an additional 145,000 new shares being issued here and 16,333 here. So my subtotal for my diluted EPS calculation is going to be 99 cents a share, which is less than $1.25, so I'm fine. Now, the next most dilutive, again, I'm going in order from most to least dilutive. I can see here that the debentures, each of the debentures have an EPS impact which is less than the preferreds. So the preferreds are going to, or sorry, more than the preferreds. So the preferreds are going to go first because they're more dilutive than the either of the debentures. So therefore, now I put the preferreds in this position in the diluted EPS cascade, and we just calculated above that they would have increased had they been converted at the earliest opportunity, October the 1st. We would have avoided paying dividends of $37,500, so that would have increased your earnings to common by that much, and we would have had 67,500 shares on average outstanding. So that would give us a subtotal of 790,000. Adding down this way, it would have increased our WACs, or we would have had WACs here of 829,166, which would lead us to a diluted EPS calculation of 95 cents a share, which is less than this. So things are looking good. This number is supposed to get smaller, okay, and further away from your basic EPS. If it doesn't at any point in time, then you probably already reached your most dilutive position. Now, the last thing we're going to put in here is we're going to put in the 8% debentures, right? So therefore, they're the more dilutive than these $1, 9.5% debentures, which have an EPS impact of $1. So therefore, these guys are going to go before these 9.5% debentures. So let's put them in. So now we know the 8% debentures. We saw earlier that had we converted them earlier, we would have avoided interest expense after tax of $129,600. And on a what-if scenario, we would have issued 175,000 new shares earlier in the year. So that means that our subtotal now for our diluted EPS calculation is rounded to 92 cents a share. So now, the last thing we want to look at are these 9.5% debentures. But here's the deal. We know earlier on, we could see that these 9.5% debentures have an EPS impact, which by the time we get here already exceeds our diluted EPS calculation. That's a clue to us that even though they tested dilutive here, if we had included these 9.5% debentures, they would have given us an anti-dilutive position. So I could say right now that because these 9.5% debentures have an EPS impact, which is already greater than my most dilutive earnings per share position, okay, at this point in time, I already know that they're going to be excluded from my diluted EPS calculation. So I'm telling you now, this is your diluted EPS. But say you didn't know that rule. Say you forgot it. Say you didn't come to class that day, or you didn't get the notes that day, or something happened, you didn't know. You could put it in and see it yourself, because we know those 9.5% debentures would be at the bottom of the diluted EPS cascade if we had forgotten and we by mistake included them, and they are going to increase the earnings available to common through the EPS impact of $150,000. They would have increased your WACs by $150,000. So if we did our diluted EPS calculation, if we rounded to the nearest dollar, we could see that would be 93 cents, which is greater than 92 cents. So therefore, we know that these are anti-dilutive. So therefore, because they're anti-dilutive, we already have our most diluted EPS situation here at 92 cents. So this concludes our diluted EPS review question.